Welcome. Uh, these are cruel days. I think you all know that. So it's especially gratifying that you've joined us. The Nation is an independent publication. We've been around since 1865. We continue our fierce, fearless journalism. You'll hear about that from Amy today. But I do think these are times when independent media like The Nation are ever more critical. And I hope you agree and support us as we move forward. Just two things. We nominated Minneapolis for a Nobel Peace Prize. We believe Minneapolis will receive it. And we're in Mamdani's New York, and a glimmer of hope as he uh, hires some extraordinary people and tries to bring affordability to a city that hasn't seen it in a long time and do much more than that. But today we're honored to have Amy Littlefield, who has come from first of all, let me just say that the right to abortion has been a priority in the nation's coverage for decades. The magazine has been covering the issue since well before the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. Longtime columnist Katha Pollitt, maybe she's on, the award-winning author of Pro Reclaiming Abortion Rights, has been a very important voice, not just at the nation, but in the nation of the nation, arguing for a reframed conception of abortion as a common part of a woman's reproductive life, one that should be accepted as a moral right. And as the magazine's first ever abortion access correspondent, Amy Littlefield has written extensively and with impact on reproductive rights, healthcare, and religion, following in Katha's footsteps, but her own person. Amy had been reporting on reproductive healthcare and abortion for a decade when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022. And after the staggering demise of legal abortion, Amy sought to understand the media, the hidden architects of this once in a lifetime victory, the motives, the means, the opportunities that allowed them to succeed, pairing her poignant reporting, fearless, tough reporting, with her love for murder mysteries. Her new book, Killers of Roe, is an abortion whodunit that introduces unexpected characters, secret killers, and suspects, and hidden motives behind the death of a fundamental human right. To close, you are in for a journey this next hour. For the next hour, Amy will be talking to Nation's senior editor, Regina Mahone, about her new book. Regina founded and runs the Nation's monthly Repro Nation newsletter, Sign Up, which covers the latest news and analysis on the global struggle for reproductive freedom and the struggle at home. The book she co-authored, Liberating Abortion, Claiming Our History, Sharing Our Stories, and Building the Reproductive Future We Deserve, traces the history of abortion and the necessity of recentering people of color in the fight for reproductive justice. And I know she'll be asking some quintessentially insightful questions today. So I look forward to a lively, enlightening conversation. I'm very grateful to those who've joined and grateful to Amy and Regina. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Katrina. That was a very lovely introduction. I am going to just add a little bit more about Amy, just because Amy and I have known each other for over a decade now. I remember years ago, I took a tour of Democracy Now! With our colleagues at Women Action in the Media, WAM NYC. And I just remember thinking it was so cool that Amy worked at this critically important news organization and that she was infusing her feminist politics and values into her journalism work there. And Amy continued to do that as an investigative reporter at Rewire News Group, where we worked together for several years, covering the beginning of the end, I guess I'll call it, or I guess the most recent beginning of the end of Roe in the 2010s. And now, as Katrina said, Amy is the abortion access correspondent for The Nation. She's been doing incredible investigations on the nuances of the abortion rights fight that are so often overlooked in other coverage and at other publications. And so I'm just so delighted to be here today to celebrate Amy's brilliant new book, Killers of Roe. It is such an important work. I think, as I said to Amy, I think what impressed me most was the footwork that Amy did in really like finding these lesser known murderers of Roe and having in-person conversations with them. And so, yeah, let's just get into this conversation. I think starting with Amy, what really inspired you to write this book? And specifically, you center your investigation on the death of Roe around the Hyde Amendment. What brought that about?
Thank you so much, Katrina and Regina, and what an honor to be part of the legacy of robust reporting on abortion rights at the nation. I am seeing people in the chat saying they're having trouble with sound. Can anyone give a thumbs up to say whether they can hear me? Okay, I just boosted my levels a little bit. We'll keep an eye on that. I'm just so delighted to be here and be hosted by a publication that understands the importance of abortion rights and how connected it is to everything else going on in our world right now. I think Regina and I, who cover abortion full time, hear a lot from people, oh, that topic's really fallen off the radar lately. And the reality is that all around the world and throughout history, we know that authoritarianism and crackdowns on reproductive freedom go hand in hand. There's a robust body of scholarship on how abortion rights are often the first to go in fascist societies. And that's because it's essential, right, to controlling women, to controlling population, and cementing the relationships that with religious conservatives that allow unpopular policies to be imposed on the population. And so I just want to say that I've always seen this as timely. I know Regina and the nation have too, and I'm so grateful to all of you who agree. So the book starts out with the Hyde Amendment, which is a 50-year-old policy that restricts federal funding of abortion on Medicaid. I see it as the opening salvo in two contemporary wars, one on women and one on the poor. And basically, this is sort of the conservative movement's agenda in a nutshell, right? It was saying, all right, abortion is a legal right. And yet, we are going to take away the ability of low income people to access it. Now, Henry Hyde and his allies, and I reveal some of the hidden allies, it wasn't Henry Hyde's idea, spoiler alert. There were some other people involved, even though it has his name on it. They knew they couldn't ban abortion for everyone. Pretty quickly after Roe v. Wade made abortion a constitutional right in 1973, we saw public opinion tilting in favor of keeping that decision rather than overturning it. And so the minority of people who wanted to eliminate that right that was becoming more popular and now is more popular than I think any politician except Mom Donnie. I haven't checked the latest numbers, but I think that's true. Um, and so what they did is they banned abortion for poor people specifically, right? They took a population that had an approval rating that was less, right? Low income women, often coded as Black, welfare recipients, and they said, we are going to restrict your rights. And this was also an early use of a pattern that I would see in this book, which was opponents of abortion rights shamelessly co-opting the language of the civil rights movement in order to roll back civil rights, right? So they used the terminology right to life. That was very intentional. They were forming this sort of white people's civil rights movement, which is what historian Jennifer Holland calls it. And it was really a reaction to women and people of color asserting their rights. And so, how fitting that the first target was poor people. And it shaped the abortion access landscape in ways that we take for granted today, right? Regina and I both know many of the most dedicated activists in this space. What do? They spend their days raising the millions of dollars that it takes to pay for people's abortions, and now the many hours of travel that can be involved in accessing one. And that, had to happen because the federal government withdrew funding for this essential health care with this policy that passed in 1976. Will mark its 50th anniversary this year.
Amazing. So the interesting thing about Hyde, as you talk about in the book, is how our assumptions about political parties is are not right when it comes to Hyde. And you talk about how there is, the Hyde was sealed with a anti-abortion Democrat, and and the person who attempted to prevent it from happening was a pro-choice Republican. And so you talk about how there's this long history of the anti-abortion movement and how it really wasn't until Ronald Reagan was elected president that the anti-abortion movement became solidly aligned with the Republican Party. And so it wasn't just that one anti-abortion Democrat and that one pro-choice Republican. Like there were a number of them in history, and it really shifted after the politics of abortion, literal politics and political parties around abortion shifted after and during Ronald Reagan's time. And so, can you talk about that, and specifically because you talked too about the Catholic Church and the role of the Catholic Church and really cementing that alignment? So, could you talk a bit more about that? Because I do think that is something on the left that people don't generally understand.
Yes, thank you for that question. It's fascinating looking back at the historical record from the 1970s, and some of the most vociferous, feminist voices are coming from pro-choice Republicans, right? Some of the staunchest allies for groups like NARAL in the 1970s were pro-choice Republicans, like Senator Bob Packwood, who I interviewed for my book, now in his 90s. Problematic guy, sexually accused of sexually harassing no less than 48 women. And so he's one of the complicated characters in this history. But he made this staunch and often intersectionally feminist defense of abortion rights, at the same time that he was, harassing women behind the scenes. And then you also see Democrats who were Catholic and quite anti-abortion. I found out actually that one of my beloved local politician, Senator Ed Markey, started out being anti-abortion until the head of NARAL was seated next to him on a plane and changed his mind. So that's another fun story in the book. Um, so in the beginning, in the 1970s, the Catholic Church really was the anti-abortion movement, right? And that gave them a huge organizing advantage because what's a better network to organize than the Catholic Church at that point? They had dioceses all over the country, with a captive audience in their congregation. And that was actually how the Hyde Amendment got passed. So it wasn't like it was Henry Hyde's brilliance, right? So indeed, what happened is that there was a very influential Democrat named Dan Flood. He was in charge of the subcommittee that ran the appropriations bill, which was the huge, funding bill that they were tacking this Hyde Amendment onto to try to sneak through this abortion funding ban. An early use of a strategy, a sneaky strategy that's now become totally normal in our politics somehow. And Dan Flood hated the Hyde Amendment. He gave this vociferous speech against it. He said, I'm against abortion. He came from a heavily Catholic district. So I'm against abortion, but this is not a ban on abortion. This is a attack on poor people, as plain as the nose on your face. This is unfair, right? It restricts abortion access only for poor people. And then what happened is that the Catholic Church, a lobbyist, got everybody in his district, all the Catholic pastors, to write letters. And Dan Flood got thousands of letters from opponents of abortion, and he flipped. And all of a sudden, he thought the ban would be a terrific idea. And there were enough Democrats, leading up to the 1976 election when Jimmy Carter was running, of course, and when evangelicals were becoming a really important political faction, sort of for the first time. There were Democrats who probably believed that abortion should stay legal, but were afraid about the idea of voting for taxpayer funding for poor people for abortion. And this was really the sort of beginning of the Hyde Amendment becoming viewed as a middle ground, as something that Democrats and Republicans, that people on both sides of this issue could accept, and were at least unwilling to challenge. But even after Reagan was elected, those political lines that we take for granted now were far from solid. I mean, Mary Ziegler points out in her book After Roe, between 1973 and 1984, when Reagan was elected for the second time, Democrats sponsored most of the anti-abortion legislation in Congress. And Title 10, which created a program that still exists today, although it's under constant attack, to fund contraception for low-income Americans, that program was signed by a Republican president, Richard Nixon. And the restriction that specified that money could not go to abortions was brought forward by a Democrat. So very complicated. And this history at every level, the Hyde Amendment passed a Congress that had a Democratic majority, right? So
Mm-hmm.
every single level of this history includes Democratic complicity.
We are going to talk more about complacency and maintaining the status quo, but I want to talk a bit more about storytelling because so often the anti-abortion lawmakers who become pro-choice, it's generally stories, right? Like powerful stories. And It's usually someone who's had an abortion, or the folks who were pro-choice Republicans. They say it was because they talked to people who had abortions, about their experiences. And so I'm thinking a lot about storytelling as you're talking about this political divide and the way that elections can be used to you talk a lot in the book about opportunism. But there are so many vivid stories in your book that resonate, and I know we're going to stay with me for a long time. I think a lot about, you describe in such detail your experience watching Paul Herring, who wrote the first draft of the Hyde Amendment, eat a chicken sandwich from Chick-fil-A. And like, I think people are not going to think about Chick-fil-A the same way. Hopefully they don't for other reasons, but also because of the way you describe him, like eating that chicken sandwich. As you say, there's like no neat way to eat a chicken sandwich. And so it's just wild. But then also, there's this really wonderful interaction between you and your firstborn, where you're talking about the serial kisser Bob Packwood you talked about, and your firstborn asks, is Bob Packwood a good guy or like a bad guy? And what struck me most about that interaction with all of the murderers of with your firstborn, but then also all of your interactions with the murders of Roe that you interviewed in person, is how you really do bring out their humanity. And so this goes back to storytelling, in that we're connecting with other people on these baseline levels. And so I wanted to talk with you about that, because I have to imagine, as you're talking to these people who are responsible for literal deaths, right? From the Hyde Amendment, from these other policies, or otherwise, abusing women, sexually harassing women, you still manage to bring out their humanity, for better, for worse, talking about the chicken sandwich or other examples. And so what was that experience like for you, in your reporting and your research, and how you, square the circle around these people and their disregard for dead women, but also their humanity?
Thank you for asking that, Regina. I had a really interesting conversation with your co-author about this. So, Regina and Renee Bracey Sherman wrote an absolutely essential book called Liberating Abortion that you could see on the shelf behind Regina. I want to say it pairs really well with mine. And I remember when Renee and I were both working on our books, we got lunch together, and I said to Renee, "Oh, I wanted to ask you, how much does your book deal with the other side? How much do you deal with the anti-abortion movement?" And she was like, "What the heck are you talking about? I don't want to deal with them. Like, I wrote this book. Renee's an organizer, right? She's like, I wrote this book for Black women, for people of color who have had abortions, and that's who this book is for. This is not." And I was like, "Oh," and she was like, "That's not my job," basically, is what she was saying. And I was like, that totally makes sense. And also, I think it's my job, right? I have this problem, which is that I look like this, right? I'm a cis white woman. When I went to Moms for Liberty, I blended in so well in that space that the activists outside were afraid to talk to me. And I had a little bit of identity crisis about it later. And so I think because I feel safe in right-wing spaces, and because I don't get immediately cornered, a person of color goes into those spaces, I think they get cornered and people want to recruit them because they're such a rarity. Um, that I really felt like, okay, this is my Miss Marple moment, right? Shout out to the Agatha Christie fans in the chat. This is the moment for me, to use my privilege as an unassuming white lady, to go and talk and listen to these people. I see that as the service that I can provide to, the movement for abortion rights and social justice, is deep listening. And it is difficult sometimes. It does make me angry sometimes, but there's an enormous amount of gratification when you can learn more about the person in front of you and come to see them as a human being and understand how they were shaped and created by the forces of history. Because that gives me hope that if humans created this moment of injustice where we are right now, then human beings can take it down, right? And one of the things I learned is that they did so by copying the playbook of the left, right? This is a grassroots movement that was extremely successful, that frankly out-organized the abortion rights movement almost every step of the way. Okay, and that's a pretty devastating fact. However, they did so by co-opting, the enormous success of the civil rights movement and feminism, and so. Um, I think there's hope in that. I'm a reader of Arlie Russell Hochschild, the sociologist, and she talks about the empathy wall between red and blue America, which is something she saw in her reporting on Tea Party adherents in Louisiana. And she wrote a challenge to her, fellow progressives after that experience and said, why don't you take the time to have a conversation with someone different from you and consider that if you were in their situation, you might have ended up like them. It's a pretty terrifying proposition, actually, right? But I really tried to take it seriously. I tried to put myself in Paul Herring's shoes. I thought if I had been raised in Texas, in the 1950s by a mom who told me that, if I was good and followed God's plans, I was going to go to heaven and I'd be reunited with her and everybody that I love. And all I had to do was follow the Catholic teachings. And if I went to church twice a week and, and if I was a man, not a woman, could I imagine that? And I think that's how we understand not just the, sort of evil villains at the top of the food chain, right? The Supreme Court justices, the lawyers arguing before the Supreme Court, the President of the United States. We know a lot about those folks because we hear about them a lot. I was interested in the grassroots figures, and those folks feel a lot more human and a lot more interesting to me.
Mhm. Well, it takes all of us. And so we all have different work we need to do. And those of us who don't feel strongly compelled to do that work because of the potential attacks or harassment we might experience differently appreciate that you that you did that work. But you also are having uncomfortable conversations with people, pro-choice movement leaders, right? Like Frances Kissling. You don't go into all of the detail of all of the arguments that you both had in Mexico, but there were some, where you highlighted, you both, I think there were like all caps involved in those descriptions of those conversations. But you and Frances Kissling were talking about Rosie Jimenez. So Rosie Jimenez, I don't think we've actually talked that much about Rosie, but Rosie Jimenez is considered the first person to die after the Hyde Amendment took effect. And her death, after her death, it was this movement moment where people were like, okay, this is what's going to change everything. Like people are going to find out that a mother died after seeking an abortion that was illegal because her Medicaid insurance no longer covered it, even though she had had two prior abortions that were covered by those providers she sought care from again. And they said, no, you can't get that care because your health insurance doesn't cover it, which raises all sorts of other questions about our healthcare system and the fact that providers can just deny people the care that they need because they don't have the money for it. But Frances Kissling co-wrote this book. It's actually behind me. And maybe it's behind you too, called Rosie. And so you went to Frances to talk about, the documentation of her death, the questions and challenges around that documentation, but also why it was that her death wasn't enough and why it was that it seemed like after a while and the Hyde Amendment became the law, the Hyde Amendment became the status quo, that large mainstream white-led organizations, reproductive rights organizations decided, you know what, we have to move on to another topic because we're not winning on this one. And so I'd love for you to talk about that. Specifically, I think that it is really hard to know that people have died and continue dying. Like if we draw the line from Rosie Jimenez to Amber Nicole Thurman, you talk about Becky Bell and on your Democracy Now! Segment, which everyone should definitely watch. You also talk about Becky Bell. This is a 17-year-old girl. So we're not even just talking about women. We're talking about girls who died because of parental consent law. Because in her state of Indiana, they had a law that required her to get permission from her parents to have an abortion. She felt that she didn't want to disappoint her parents by getting that permission, so she got an illegal abortion and she died. And her parents advocated on her behalf. Now her cousin, I believe, is advocating on her behalf. And the lawmakers are staring those folks dead in their face, the survivors of people who died from abortions, not doing anything, signing those laws anyway. And so if you could just talk about what it means, like what you concluded, what it means that there's still this disregard for dead women and what it means for like the fight that we have to now continue.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that question and for summarizing that history so well. I see the disregard for dead women, especially women of color, as a central tenet of anti-abortion politics and understanding where we are today. And this is very live in our politics today, right? Because of ProPublica's reporting, we found out about women like Tierra Walker, who, needed an abortion because she had preeclampsia and was really sick and couldn't get one in Texas. And so her son JJ finds her slumped over her bed on his birthday, right? We know about women like you mentioned, Amber Nicole Thurman. We know about women like Candy Miller, who developed complications from a medication abortion, which are rare and totally treatable. But she was afraid to seek care because she was in Georgia. And so her husband finds her dead in her bed with her 3-year-old daughter beside her. Okay. How do these policies continue, even though we know the names of these women, we know their stories, we know about the children they've left behind? That's one of the central questions of my book. And because Rosie was the first to die from the Hyde Amendment, I talk about her first death, and then I talk about her second death, which is the death that happened when the pro choice movement and Democrats who were charged with defending and avenging this woman's death allowed the policy that killed her to become mainstream politics, to become accepted, to become something that centrist Democrats like Joe Biden defended for years, right? Until true believers in our own movement made that untenable. Um, and so, the chapter with Frances kissing, and I think Frances is here, so she'll chime in the Q&A and she will tell you how obnoxious I was because she graciously invited me to her home in Mexico. And pretty much from the second I arrived, she and I started shouting at each other. And because what happens when you're with someone you almost agree with is that you're gravitated immediately towards the things you disagree on. And so pretty much from the moment we got in the car to drive to her home outside Mexico City, Francis and I were at each other's throats over, later abortion and was it okay to restrict it, over, race and messaging and so I use her as sort of a stand-in to talk about the differences within the abortion rights movement. And I also really valued her as a source because she's someone who's really honest. I think she gets herself into trouble a lot because she's really honest and she reaches for a nuance that the politics of abortion really don't tolerate. Um, but because she's so honest, she was the one who said to me, listen, pro-choice groups didn't seem to care that Rosie Jimenez had died. And when I dug into the history, I found it was a little more complicated than that. I found these sort of turning points in the record where pro-choice activists really had fought very hard to try to stop Hyde when it was first introduced. And then they had assumed that they could stop it at the Supreme Court. And of course, in 1980, the Supreme Court upheld the Hyde Amendment. And in the wake of that, and with Ronald Reagan coming into office, I found notes from a meeting where pro choice leaders, most of whom were white, were sitting around a table literally saying, we have to set poor women aside for now and really deal with the fact that we might have a total nationwide ban with this new administration coming in. And I was like, oh my gosh, it was right there in black and white. Again, it was more complicated. There were other meetings, there were other discussions, and there were people who I think never forgot about Rosie Jimenez. And that's for me where the hope is, okay? Because Rosie's memory is still alive within the work and the activism of the true believers in our movement. And it's why I end the book talking about organizers in Texas and how every single session in the state legislature, they introduce a bill that would not just repeal the state's now many anti-abortion laws, but it will restore full funding of contraception, IVF, full reproductive freedom in the state of Texas. They introduce that law every year. They know it won't pass, right? They know it's not going anywhere in the Texas state legislature, right? A place that's entertaining the idea that women should get the death penalty for abortion. That's not happening there. And yet they do it every single year. And what do they call it? They call it Rosie's Law. And so that's where the hope is. That's where the justice is, right, in our movement. It doesn't come from above. It doesn't come from the Supreme Court. It comes from the folks who are keeping the names of these women alive in their work.
Absolutely. I think that speaks to the radical reimagination. You had published a piece, an excerpt from the book at The Nation, on the day that your book came out this week, on Tuesday, about that and how it's so important to hold in these times. It is challenging, especially because again, it feels like there are through lines with what happened around the time of Hyde in the 70s, where folks were like, well, the Supreme Court's not going to let this through, you know? But then what happened? And we're seeing that today with other things, right? Where it's like, well, these institutions will prevent these horrific things from happening, and those institutions have no spines, right? And so, and you know, finding loopholes and things like that. And it makes me think of all of the contradictions that you bring up in the book, because the conservative movement, the anti-abortion movement, they don't care about these contradictions. Like, it's not a priority for them. It's just like, well, you know, even though those things don't really, you know, make sense, that I can, you know, care about having a small government at the same time that I want to go, you know, reach as far as I can to be able to control your decisions about your body and how you live your lives. That doesn't matter, because we have a goal in mind, which is just complete and control power. And how we maintain power is continuing to erode and take back all of your rights until you have none left. So yeah, I wonder, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add just about these contradictions of the movement, and how we can continue to overcome them, because as you talk about in the final chapter, you know, it does sound like it's this people power, right? Holding on to, bringing it back to radical reimagination, like holding on to that people power.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to talk about a piece I wrote for Crime Reads where I talked about the murder mystery theme of the book.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking about as I was listening to you talk
Yeah.
about these contradictions and about how the activists, even at the grassroots, right, how the activists involved in this political project embody or tolerate them, right? Like, I talked to a lot of people who are like, I'm anti-abortion and I see myself as a civil rights activist, and I also support principles of social justice, and yet they're willing to vote for Trump, right? They're horrified by what's happening to immigrants, and yet they're willing to vote for Trump because they see abortion as, well, Ronald Reagan called it the right without which all other rights have no meaning. Sorry, he's talking not about the right to abortion, of course, but the right to life. That's pretty convenient if what you want is to restrict the rights of every single person except the fetus, right? Who in the conservative imagination is almost always white. It's pretty convenient. And that's how abortion was used opportunistically as part of a conservative project, right? They built this parallel civil rights movement for fetuses. By joining it, you could not have to think about race. You could not have to think about gender. Or, you know, you might think about it pretty intensely and think the clock should be rolled out to 1950s, you know, before the civil rights movement and feminism really got their foothold. Um, but I want to end on a hopeful note, and I want to talk about what I call the quiet housekeepers, right? The murder mystery theme of the book really came about as a way for me to entice myself to write about these difficult characters, and the combination of opportunity and true belief that allowed them to overturn our constitutional right to abortion. And in a murder mystery, the payoff at the end is always that it's the person you'd least suspect, right? You know, the detective solves the mystery, and it's the quiet housekeeper who is standing in the corner the whole time. And you know, you didn't even notice them, or you forgot about them, right? This is who I see, like the Paul Herrings of the world, right? This former IRS attorney who I spent more time with than anyone in this book, because not because he was famous, because he wasn't, but because he kept trying to convert me to Catholicism, and he just believed so hard in what he was doing, and I was really trying to understand that belief and what made him tick. Um, and so finding these quiet housekeeper types, unspooling their surprising motives became the heart of this book. And I found those people, quiet housekeepers, on the right side of history too, right? I found them in the ranks of the abortion rights movement, in the ranks of the group All Above All, which started this long shot campaign to repeal the Hyde Amendment right after the Affordable Care Act passed, when Democrats and mainstream activists were like, what are you doing? We just got this healthcare bill through, and in order to do it, we had to promise no taxpayer funding of abortion. Like, know how many times we had to swear the Hyde Amendment was going to stand, and now you're going to try to repeal it? Like, stop it. Don't talk about poor people. Don't talk about welfare. Don't talk about public funding. And those folks did it anyway. And what did they do? They changed the way we talk about public funding of abortion. They forced Joe Biden to reverse his stance and to say, using their language, I don't think access should be determined based on someone's zip code. Oh my God, you know, that came right out of their brochure practically. And so, you know, I see a lot of hope in those quiet housekeepers on our side as well. I see this as the moment of the quiet housekeeper. Oh my God, that image of the reporter in Minneapolis who's standing out on the street with her phone filming in her bathrobe, right? The folks in their minivans who are dropping off their kids at school and then going out to defend their immigrant neighbors, right? The people you might not suspect are getting involved in the work of justice and protecting their neighbors and standing up against this fascist administration that is wreaking havoc, especially on the vulnerable populations among us. And there's tremendous hope in that. And um, my book is really about the quiet housekeepers on the anti-abortion side, but also the ones I see moving to the forefront within the abortion rights movement as well.
Amazing. I think that is such a smart approach, and it's why your book is so important, and folks should definitely pick it up. So we're going to start to take some questions from the chat. If you still have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat, and we'll get to it if we can. I guess I'll start from the top. So we have this question from Karen Humphrey, and thank you all who have submitted questions already. We really appreciate it. So this is a question that I think so they're asking, does the book look at strategies like the 50-year-old effort to reshape the courts, especially the federal courts, as conservative? I go ahead if you'd like to go ahead and answer that around how, because it doesn't exactly, but it does it in a different way,
Right,
like talk about
right.
the conservative push.
Sure, sure. Thank you for that question. So, if you want a straightforward history of how Roe v. Wade was overturned and the Supreme Court strategy, I would recommend Mary Ziegler's work, and I would recommend The Fall of Roe by two journalists at the New York Times who wrote a history over the past. Theirs focuses on the 10 years leading up to the Dobbs decision and how Alliance Defending Freedom really shaped the strategy that was going to overturn Roe v. Wade. My book mentions that history. It's not in depth focused on the Supreme Court because, again, I was interested in the question of how the anti abortion movement created what I think is the most successful, or at least one of the most successful social movements of our time, which is a big part of how, and I think an underexplored part of how they overturned Roe v. Wade, right? They got there, yes, through decisions. Leonard Leo played a huge role, right? Basically handed Trump a list of Supreme Court appointees who were selected for their anti-abortion beliefs, and those folks got on the court. And that was the final piece, right? Couldn't have reversed Roe without that. And yet there was a lot that happened in the 50 years leading up to that at the grassroots level as well that I think is really important and worth looking at.
The second part of the question uh, was about how do we get the public to understand and reverse deliberate policy trends that are anti-women. I do think there's a question that bridges the gap between the shape of the courts as conservative and get the public. I mean, like, because there's both what is happening and who is running the country and how they're dismantling rights, but then there's also motivating the public, and that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is around like how we build continue to build momentum around this issue. And I also wonder sometimes if people, when they're asking, say that no one's really talking about abortion, if it's because it's coming from this place of, well, the people around them aren't doing any actual advocacy or rights or reading those articles that are out, about abortion. But how do we continue to build momentum and get the public to fight for the overturning of what's, all of these, like they say, anti-woman, anti-pregnant people, anti-abortion policies? And do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah. So the first part of the question about the Supreme Court, I mean, the Supreme Court is an anti-democratic institution, right? And this is why I think abortion rights and democracy go hand in hand, right? Because this is one of the most popular issues. Abortion rights is extremely popular, has been for decades. And so you really can't restrict it with democratic means, right? This is why we see attempts to resuscitate the 1873 Comstock Act, because it's their best shot at a nationwide abortion ban is a law from the 19th century that was an anti-obscenity law, right? That tried to crack down on, pornographic drawings being sent through the mail. Okay. That's how much they know. I mean, the fact that the Trump administration is slow walking its review of the abortion pill mifepristone until
Mm-hmm.
after the midterm elections tells you everything you need to know about how they understand the population is against them on this issue. Right. And so, Ali Mistal, our colleague, likes to say he's a
Yep.
single issue voter, and that issue is the Supreme Court, right? Like the Supreme Court, if it were expanded, it would look pretty different in terms of its representation of the American people. And so the second part of the question was about how we keep this issue alive. I think it's really challenging for two reasons right now. One is that a lot of the most committed folks in this space are doing the very brave and necessary but super quiet work of just keeping access afloat, right? There are clinicians in states like Massachusetts and New York who are mailing abortion medication into red states. They're getting sued, they're getting, attempts to prosecute them from these red states. They're operating under shield laws in 8 states that protect people who mail abortion drugs into states where abortion is banned. That incredibly courageous work has resulted in this astounding fact that abortions have gone up every year since the Supreme Court overturned the nationwide right to abortion, which is a staggering, testament to how hard the folks in this space are working. And the abortion fund activists who raise money to pay for these abortions, right? Or to help the folks who still need to get to a clinic to travel, right? Millions of dollars. I think it's $63 million, the last data that I looked at, that the abortion funds across this country were able to raise and spend, which is an astounding amount of money. Um, and so it's pretty hard for those folks who have their heads down to pick their heads up and do the work. And then when they do, it's like, okay, the emergency, the massive number of unintended births that we thought was going to happen after the Dobbs decision, it has happened to a degree. There have been, I think the estimates are 22,000 additional births since Dobbs and 59 additional maternal deaths, which is significant. One of those should be enough. But it hasn't been this huge headline, news of a huge spike in unintended pregnancies because these efforts to get pills to people at great personal risk to those doing it are so successful. And so I think that's a tough, it's tough to break through this, horrific news cycle of genocide and war that we're in today if the headline is like, it's not as bad as we thought. Right. But
Absolutely.
it's still, I do want to say it's not super rosy and beautiful because for the, I have a piece coming out in the next few days with the New York Review of Books about this abortion access landscape and the experience of getting an abortion within it. It is fraught with fear and it can be fraught with medical risk, not because medication abortion is risky, but because people who self-manage their abortions with pills they get from online are often afraid to seek follow-up care. Am I still pregnant? I'm bleeding. Is this a normal amount to bleed? Do I have retained tissue? I'm in pain. Is it okay to see my doctor? Can I tell her? And it's reasonable to be afraid of that because in about half of cases where people have been criminalized, it's been the healthcare workers who have called the police. And so I don't want to sugarcoat it by any means. But I think it's a complicated story and it's hard. To break through, in the news cycle with complicated stories. It always has been.
Absolutely. And and I want to jump to this question around because you mentioned mailing of medication abortion, and you've covered the abortion pill underground for the nation and reporting. And I wonder, Crystal Peters asked about, the doctor from California being targeted for extradition, also provider in New York being targeted for extradition for mailing medication to a woman in another state and to other people for the doctor in New York, a person in another state. I wonder if you could talk about that, the challenges. So you talked about how it is a bright spot to be able to mail, and to be protected to some degree under these shield laws that have been created that allow providers to, practice medicine in this way, but not face in their home state legal repercussions for doing so. But there are other states around the country that are targeting those doctors. And so I wonder if you could talk more about, through your reporting, what you found and with this issue to Crystal Peters' question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know pregnancy criminalization has increased since the Dobbs decision. We know that the number of people who are having the police called on them, being investigated for their pregnancy outcomes has gone up. I think it's more than 400 cases that Pregnancy Justice was able to document. There's a recent investigation by the Marshall Project that suggests that number could be way higher, right? This investigation found 70,000 cases where people had authorities informed of their that they were purportedly on drugs, right? Often these were false positives on drug tests that can result from something as simple as eating a poppy seed bagel, right? And so we're looking at maybe tens of thousands of people facing the threat of their kids being taken away. The criminalization is often the very folks who have always been criminalized in this country, right? People of color, the majority of people in the cases that have been studied are low income. And almost all of the cases that were recorded by Pregnancy Justice were folks who were accused of using illicit drugs, right? So this is, the history from Dorothy Roberts' book, Killing the Black Body, of surveillance and policing of Black women in pregnancy that is still alive to this day. It's just that now the people who are investigating and surveilling and policing people for their pregnancy outcomes have a lot more weapons at their disposal and have a widespread climate of fear and confusion surrounding these abortion bans, right? I think a lot of people taking abortion pills in places like Texas wonder, does this mean that what I'm doing is illegal? And we know that there's only one state that actually criminalizes self-managed abortion itself, and that's only after 24 weeks, and that's Nevada. But that doesn't stop, zealous prosecutors from using homicide laws or abuse of a corpse laws to go after somebody who has a miscarriage or someone who they accuse of taking abortion pills. And so it's a really confusing and I think fearful landscape sometimes for the people who are going through these experiences in isolation. And I think the experiences range, right? Some people are like, oh my God, I'm so grateful I was able to just take these pills in the comfort of my own home and manage my abortion, and I wouldn't have been able to get access otherwise. And, it was a positive experience. And then there's folks who are like, gee, I sure would have liked to go to a clinic, but it was an 18-hour round trip drive. I couldn't tell my abusive husband. And so, I had to do this and it wasn't a great experience. So I think that access has really expanded in strange ways, right? These medication abortion options are very affordable, but choices have narrowed. And
Absolutely.
there's a lot of fear, yeah, surrounding it.
This speaks to the contradictions you talk about in the book because the movement has been arguing that the goal was to overturn Roe, but actually what we're seeing is the criminalization of pregnant people. If you're pregnant and in a region where criminalization is heightened, you are a suspect for what might happen for your pregnancy. And I know you had also interviewed Mary Ziegler about that and what their actual intentions are, which, again, to highlight the contradiction of the movement, because it really isn't what they said. It goes deeper than that, much deeper than that. And the people that are disproportionately affected are people of color in other targeted communities, poor people. So yeah, and Crystal had a follow-up question about drug testing women after birth. Question about the states. I don't know if you know offhand, like which states beyond Tennessee, or if you wanted to elaborate more on that.
Sorry, which
Oh,
states?
about which are drug testing women after birth.
Oh, I would encourage you to go to the Marshall Project, and maybe Ryan can drop the link in the chat to Shoshana Walters' big investigation in the Marshall Project that digs into. She was able to get data from many different states about how many cases they're seeing of people being reported to law enforcement. I mean, it hits me on a visceral level, the idea of, as someone who recently gave birth myself, the idea of women who are sitting there with their babies on their chest and having them ripped away because of a false positive on a drug test. Sometimes it's the fentanyl in someone's epidural that triggers it. Um, and so I would encourage you to check out that investigation as well as Pregnancy Justice to find more information on that.
Absolutely. And there is a question from someone who posted anonymously about going back to the mainstream reproductive rights organizations and other mainstream organizations like the National Organization for Women. And, this does touch on what you talk about in the book, but just, in reflecting on what has happened, people are like, well, why didn't those organizations, or why didn't the support, why didn't we had a Democratic president who had, and this goes to another question that came up, we had a Democratic president who had both the House and the Senate, like, why didn't we codify Roe? And so how would you like to answer this question around, the groups that were looking to support abortion didn't adequately protect it because
Right,
of the
right.
circumstances of the country and the way that the institutions and different levers of power were structured? How would you answer?
So I look at two of the missed opportunities to codify Roe under Democratic administrations. One of them was in the 1990s under Bill Clinton, right? Who had promised to repeal the Hyde Amendment on the campaign trail, came into office, right? And what happened is that first, the Hyde Amendment was upheld, right, despite the efforts of Black feminists. With an organization called the CARE Coalition to bring that issue and say, at last, we have control. Reagan's out, let's do this. And it didn't happen. There was a major showdown and shouting match on the congressional floor between the Black Caucus and Henry Hyde at that time over the fact that it didn't happen. And then there was another bill called the Freedom of Choice Act that could have codified Roe in that moment. And what happened is there was a fracture within the pro-choice movement and among Democrats over how far that bill should go. There's really only one dividing line, I think, in the abortion rights movement, and that is, who do we fight for? Do we fight for everybody? Low-income people, people of color, people on Medicaid, or do we fight for folks for whom keeping abortion legal is enough, right? Which is mostly going to be folks who have money and folks who live close to a clinic. Um, and that dividing line flared in the 1990s over whether the Freedom of Choice Act would attempt to repeal the Hyde Amendment and would attempt to repeal parental consent laws, right? Laws that were passed by many blue states, laws like the one that killed Becky Bell and yet proliferated, and by the time the Dobbs decision came around, all but 14 states had a parental involvement law they were enforcing, right? Um, and that conflict prevented the movement from unifying behind the Freedom of Choice Act. Senator Carol Moseley Braun, the legendary Black senator, took the fall. She withdrew her support of the bill and she got blamed when it didn't pass. I think you could blame the purists, and some people did. And you could also blame the fact that the movement didn't include all the people whose access was being stymied before that moment for allowing the Overton window to close around just protecting Roe v. Wade, right? Which is a pretty narrow demand when you look at all the people who were falling through the cracks, right? 1 in 4 people on Medicaid were unable to get an abortion when they sought one, and as a result gave birth instead. Okay, um, that's one moment I look at. I also look at the moment around the Affordable Care Act, right? And when Obama came into office, one of the first things he promised to do was to sign a bill codifying Roe. Did he do it? No. Once he was in office, he said this isn't a priority. The priority was to pass the Affordable Care Act. And the Affordable Care Act, while it was an amazing bill that expanded healthcare access to millions, it was a step backwards on abortion rights because not only did it uphold the Hyde Amendment, it allowed states to ban abortion on their exchanges. And many states do so today. And so I think there's been a lack of, I think the anti-abortion movement has always had a staunch ally in Republicans, right? Um, Even Donald Trump, who once declared himself very pro-choice, but then appointed the Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe. The Democratic alliance with the abortion rights movement has always been weaker, has always been more complicated, and I think there have been divides in the movement over how to deal with that lack of support.
In the book, you talk about the big reproductive rights groups being out organized, being outfunded by the folks on the right. But the other thing that struck me in your book is how you talk about the way the Democrats have normalized the the right the anti-abortion movement wins on abortion, Hyde being one of them. Just that's the status quo, so we can't rock the boat. Parental, you talk about, Becky Bell and parental notification laws. Like, so the way that there is widespread acceptance of things after a while harms the ability or prevents the ability of change because people become used to, well, aren't you, so it's not a matter of questioning why those things exist and uplifting the stories and experience of people and the reasons for why those things shouldn't exist. It's like, well, that's just, those things are there for a reason. But what's the reason? What's the reason for parental? You share in the story of Becky Bell's parents I think it was her mom who her testimony, it was just like, I wish that my daughter had had an abortion and I never knew about it because she would still be alive. And
Right.
so all of
And
those stories get erased. Yeah.
yeah, and sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off,
No,
but
no,
the
please.
the other thing that Karen Bell, Becky's mom, said, I mean, and this was so their 17-year-old or old daughter dies of pneumonia, right? Very suddenly, she gets extremely catastrophically ill and dies. They find out from the coroner that it's because she had an unsafe abortion. And she had told a friend, I love my parents too much. I can't tell them that I'm pregnant and disappoint them. Her parents were homecoming king and queen apart in the same high school in the Midwest. Her mom used to bring cupcakes into class. You know, they were this sort of like apolitical, Midwest couple, and their daughter dies keeping this secret. And remarkably, they decided to tell it. They decided to share it with the world. And what Karen Bell said is, I would have supported this law. I would have thought it was a great thing if my daughter gets pregnant, who I love so much gets pregnant. I want her to come to me and I'll protect her. I'll take care of her. I'll make sure she's safe. And I think that was a really appealing law for a lot of liberals. I think that was a really appealing law idea for a lot of Democratic politicians who, supported these laws in states like Massachusetts, where I live, in blue states. Like there was a lot of support over the decades for these laws and for the idea that a parent should be involved in their daughter's decision. And Karen Bell traveled far and wide at great personal risk, and her husband Bill as well. And then Becky's niece Addie took on the mantle of that work, right? She testified, and I interviewed her for a chapter in the book, testified before the Indiana state legislature to try to stop them from banning abortion outright after the Dobbs decision, and they didn't listen to her. That same institutionalized forgetting of dead women dying preventable deaths reared its head there in Indiana. And we've seen the fatal consequences of that.
I've seen some discussion of resources, questions around resources where people, in addition to your reporting and the nation's reporting, and your incredible book, are there other resources you can recommend to folks around becoming more active, maybe even ensuring they can hear those important perspectives of people who aren't accepting what's normal, but actually pushing beyond to think through what we actually need to experience freedom?
Um, well, to stay informed is the first step, right? And so I would highly recommend people subscribe to the Repro Nation newsletter. That's where you're going to find my work and insightful musings by Regina Mahone. I would also recommend checking out State's Newsroom. They have a great reproductive rights newsletter that you can sign up for, and they have reporters on the ground in these states and states like Idaho who are doing great reporting on what these state legislatures are doing, because this fight has always been in state legislatures more so than in national politics, right? I think that's one of the big mistakes that the pro-choice groups made, was to focus too much on Washington. Um, I would also be aware of three different websites that people who need an abortion should know about. I Need an A, plancpills.org if you want to find out and specifically about community support networks, and Abortion Finder. Those are the websites where people can find out information about where to get an abortion, no matter where you live in this country. Regina, do you have any other suggestions of places? Autonomy News, which is another terrific newsletter that I would recommend signing up for, worker-owned news outlet for analysis and breaking news on reproductive freedom. Garnet Henderson and Sue Rinkunis run that. And you can read an excerpt from my book there on the 40-year-old virgin trying to ban abortion nationwide.
I like to see too if one has repro legal helpline, because if you just have questions or if someone you know has questions, no matter where they are, you can get someone who's a legal expert to answer those questions, because this is and has become unfortunately for a lot of people a legal issue, and so you don't have to take risks, whatever that looks like for you, alone. You can get help and get answers to those questions. So definitely, if one has legal helpline. All right, awesome. Well, this has been incredible, Amy. Thank you so much for spending some time with us on your launch week. I'm so excited for the world to get to know these wild people that you profile in your book. And so, just all of the work that you put into it, all of the heart that you and soul that you poured into this book, it shows, and we're so lucky to be able to read it and to talk about it. So thank you so much. And I look forward to, the next Nation webinar. And we'll talk to you soon. So thank you. And thank you everyone so much for joining. And thank you, Katrina, and our colleagues at the Nation for getting us together for this conversation. Bye
Thank you so much,
bye.
Regina. Bye, everybody.
Absolutely.
Thanks for coming and for your great comments.